The attack wasn't signaled by roaring engines or the flash of massive guns. It came with a silent shudder, a sudden concussive jolt deep beneath the waterline. One minute, the Japanese freighter convoy was steaming confidently toward Singapore, laden with the raw materials desperately needed by the war machine in Tokyo. The next, the seafloor opened up, swallowing ship after ship in a terrifying span of minutes. This wasn't a skirmish. It was surgical execution. By the time the war ended, America's submarine force, just 2% of the U.S. Navy, had achieved a victory so profound, so absolute, that it fundamentally severed the industrial lifeblood of an entire empire. They didn't just win battles, they eliminated the capacity to fight. This is the moment Japan realized their greatest nightmare wore a hull of steel, navigating unseen beneath the waves.
We often talk about the great carrier battles of the Pacific, Midway, Coral Sea, Philippine Sea. These were the spectacular, high-stakes duels that dominated the headlines in history books. But the true, grinding war of attrition, the war that ultimately determined the outcome, was fought in silent, claustrophobic steel tubes hundreds of feet below the surface. This campaign, initially marred by disastrous technical failures and cautious leadership, transformed into the most lethal and efficient destroyer of logistics the world had ever seen. The statistics are chillingly definitive. U.S. submarines sank over half of all Japanese merchant shipping, systematically isolating garrisons, starving factories, and paralyzing the mighty Imperial Japanese Navy. To understand the depth of this strategic catastrophe for Japan, we must rewind to 1941. At the outbreak of the Pacific War, Japan held a nearly insurmountable advantage in operational confidence and doctrine. They believed their fleet was invincible, honed by decades of discipline and tactical focus. Their immediate goals, the seizure of the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia, were achieved with breathtaking speed. They secured the oil fields of Borneo, the rubber plantations of Malaya, and the iron ore of the Philippines. Yet, in this moment of stunning triumph, they harbored a fatal blind spot, a strategic vulnerability they dismissed as secondary, believing the glorious surface fleet was the only threat that mattered. That blind spot was the lifeline, the thousands of miles of ocean stretching between the newly conquered southern resource area and the industrial centers of the home islands. Japan was an island nation, utterly dependent on maritime trade, yet their naval doctrine treated the protection of merchant convoys, their essential commerce defense, as an afterthought. The vast majority of resources and manpower were poured into building and protecting the centerpiece of the IJN, the decisive battle fleet. The defense of logistics was relegated to older, less capable vessels, often lacking modern sonar or specialized anti-submarine weaponry. This indifference was based on historical arrogance and the belief that only a swift, decisive surface victory mattered. Contrast this with the initial state of the U.S. submarine force, the silent service, at the start of the conflict. While possessing superior submarines like the robust Gado and Palau classes, the force was plagued by bureaucratic inertia and a deeply flawed primary weapon, the Mark 14 torpedo. For the first 2 years of the war, American submariners risked their lives, endured depth charge attacks, fired perfect shots, only to witness their torpedoes run too deep, or worse, hit the target square on and fail to detonate. This was demoralizing, crippling, and infuriating, a betrayal of engineering that cost dozens of potential sinkings and the lives of men. The flaw in the Mark 14 was multifaceted, stemming from peacetime testing shortcuts and a deeply entrenched arrogance within the Bureau of Ordnance, BUORD. They relied on theoretical calculations rather than live fire tests. The magnetic exploder was overly sensitive, often detonating prematurely against the Earth's magnetic field or failing entirely. When submariners reported these failures, often in heated radio messages from the Pacific, BUORD dismissed them as either poor seamanship or combat stress. This bureaucratic nightmare meant that for crucial months, the American advantage in submersible technology was negated by a weapon that simply wouldn't work as advertised. The nightmare for Japan had not yet begun. The Americans were still fighting their own technology. The moment of change was not dictated by Washington, D.C., but by independent minds in the field, most notably Commander J.C. Red Coe and Admiral Charles Lockwood. They understood the stakes. Working outside the official channels of Buord, using their own limited resources at bases like Pearl Harbor and Australia, they began practical, deep-water tests. They fired torpedoes at cliffsides and nets, capturing photographic evidence and undeniable proof of the depth-keeping and detonator malfunctions. This grassroots revolt against poor engineering finally forced the hand of the Navy leadership, leading to the removal of the magnetic exploders and the correction of the depth-keeping mechanisms by mid-1943. This seemingly small bureaucratic victory was the ignition switch for the silent campaign. With their weapons finally functioning, American submarines could begin executing the tactical doctrines they had practiced for years. They were technologically superior to their Japanese counterparts in several critical ways. The American subs were larger, faster, and, crucially, boasted unparalleled radar technology, allowing them to hunt effectively both day and night, surface and submerged. While Japanese subs were often optimized for fleet action, focusing on scouting or carrying midget subs, the American design was purely focused on commerce raiding, the brutal, persistent targeting of the supply chain. The tactics evolved rapidly beyond single-boat attacks. Admiral Lockwood, who took command of the Pacific Submarine Force, SubPac, in 1943, championed the widespread adoption of wolfpack tactics, borrowed from German U-boat strategy but adapted for the vast Pacific distances. These coordinated groups of 3 or more submarines would patrol major sea lanes, overwhelming the weak Japanese escorts and maximizing the killing zone. When a convoy was spotted, the wolfpack would synchronize their attacks, often driving ships into the line of fire of a neighboring boat. This teamwork multiplied the lethality, making escape nearly impossible for the vulnerable merchant vessels. The turning point, the true moment the nightmare began, can be placed squarely in the summer and fall of 1943. Once the Mark 14 was fixed, the sinking rate exploded. The Japanese, who were already fighting the devastating losses from Midway and Guadalcanal, suddenly found themselves losing the indispensable resources they needed to rebuild their carrier fleet and supply their forward garrisons. The scale of the loss accelerated from manageable nuisance to strategic disaster almost overnight. Every ton of fuel oil, every barrel of rubber, every piece of steel lost to the deep meant a delay in production, or worse, an immediate operational deficiency at the front lines. The U.S. submarine campaign focused intensely on 2 critical targets: oil tankers and high-valued troop transports. Oil was the undisputed king of logistics. Japan's entire war strategy was predicated on securing the oil of the Dutch East Indies. Without it, the Imperial Navy was static. American skippers, understanding the strategic priority, would often disregard smaller, less valuable targets, patiently waiting days for the immense, slow-moving oil tankers. Each tanker sunk was not merely a loss of fuel, it represented a crippling blow to future operational capability, a battle lost before the guns were even fired. One defining, brutal example of this strategic targeting was the sinking of the fleet oiler Shokokumaru, among many others. These oilers were the lifeline that allowed the Japanese main fleet to operate far from home. Their loss forced the IJN to conserve fuel constantly, restricting training exercises and, critically, limiting their ability to react rapidly to American thrusts. It also meant that late in the war, Japanese carriers were often forced to sail with only partial fuel loads, a fatal operational handicap that degraded their speed and endurance during major encounters. The psychological toll on the Japanese merchant crews and the naval escorts was devastating. Unlike surface engagements where the enemy was visible, the submarine was an invisible, omnipresent ghost. Escorts would spend hours fruitlessly chasing sonar contacts, dropping depth charges that often missed, only for another ship to be torpedoed moments later from an entirely different angle. The stress induced panic. Escorts often abandoned the survivors of a sinking vessel to chase non-existent contacts, a brutal testament to the terror induced by the unseen predator. The Japanese response to this escalating threat was tragically slow and deeply insufficient. They continued to underestimate the severity of the loss. When they finally implemented a centralized convoy system, it was too little, too late, and lacked the necessary coordination and assets. Their best destroyers and aircraft were always prioritized for the main fleet battles, leaving anti-submarine warfare, ASW, to be handled by poorly trained crews using obsolete equipment. They simply never developed the aggressive ASW doctrine needed to counter the organized American wolfpacks.
The crucial difference wasn't just equipment, it was training and technology. American submariners benefited from better endurance, air conditioning, a massive morale booster in the tropics, and sophisticated firing calculators that allowed for quick, precise shots, even under pressure. The Japanese, conversely, suffered from rigid doctrine and poor maintenance. Their own submarine fleet was far more successful attacking American warships than supply lines, reflecting their doctrinal focus on the decisive battle rather than the war of economic attrition. By 1944, the campaign had become systematic strangulation. The American subs effectively created a maritime desert around the crucial choke points, the Luzon Strait, the East China Sea, and the routes through the Indonesian archipelago. The Luzon Strait, in particular, became known to submariners as Convoy College, due to the density of traffic funneling through the narrow waters. The sheer volume of targets allowed multiple submarines to lie in wait, sometimes sinking several ships in a single patrol, a massive return on investment for the silent service. One of the most devastating single attacks illustrating this dominance occurred in late 1944. The submarine USS Archerfish, commanded by Commander Joseph F. Enright, spotted what appeared to be an extremely large, high-value target. It was the massive Japanese aircraft carrier Shinano. While primarily designed as a logistical target, the subs usually attack supply vessels, this encounter highlighted the pervasive danger the U.S. subs posed to any Japanese vessel that dared to sail. Enright executed a textbook attack, putting 4 torpedoes into the unescorted giant, sinking the largest warship ever constructed at that point on its maiden voyage. The loss of the Shinano was spectacular, but the relentless destruction of smaller, mundane ships was the true strategic knockout blow. Every transport carrying troops to a garrison, like Rabaul or Truk, that was sunk meant those troops would never reinforce the perimeter. They would never unload their supplies. They would be left to wither, isolated, their operational effectiveness reduced to zero. The U.S. submarines were effectively performing a strategic blockade across thousands of miles of ocean, achieving what traditional surface fleets could only dream of. Let's look at the concrete numbers demonstrating the impact. By 1945, Japan had started the war with roughly 6 million tons of merchant shipping. The submarines alone accounted for sinking over 5.3 million tons, nearly 90% of the total shipping losses inflicted by all Allied forces, including surface ships and aircraft. The efficiency was staggering. For every U.S. submarine lost, and the silent service suffered the highest casualty rate of any branch of the U.S. Armed Forces, Japan paid an exponential price in lost materiel and capability. This was a war fought at a ratio heavily favoring the attacker. The climax of the logistical nightmare occurred during the decisive battles of 1944, particularly the Marianas Campaign and the Battle of Leyte Gulf. By this time, the lack of fuel was not a mere inconvenience. It was a defining operational parameter. When the massive Japanese task forces sailed out to meet the American fleet at Leyte, they were desperately short of fuel. Admiral Kurita's center force, the core of the attack, had to burn lower-grade, less efficient boiler oil, limiting their speed and maneuverability. The Japanese realized too late that their grand surface strategy was already undermined by the constant gnawing of the invisible enemy. The irony of this situation cannot overstate it. Japan's pride, the massive battleships like Yamato and Musashi, were built to project overwhelming power, yet by late 1944, they were barely capable of operational deployment due to fuel shortages. These behemoths were essentially relegated to being heavily armored floating targets.
The U.S. Navy strategy hadn't been to destroy them in a glorious slugfest, but to starve them into immobility. The true weapon against the super battleships wasn't the aircraft carrier, it was the logistics disruption caused by the submarine force. The impact extended far beyond military fuel. Japan's industrial capacity ground to a halt. Steel mills lacked the necessary iron ore and coal. Munitions factories ran short of explosives precursors. The domestic population started feeling the pinch almost immediately, as essential foodstuffs and raw materials failed to reach the home islands. This created a spiraling crisis of confidence and capability, undermining the emperor's ability to sustain the war effort, a direct result of the continuous, unremitting pressure from the silent service patrols. The psychological effect on Japan's highest military command was equally paralyzing. They began wasting precious resources trying to hunt down the submarines, diverting destroyers, seaplanes, and resources that should have been fighting the main American surface thrusts. Yet, because of poor doctrine and technology, these desperate ASW efforts were largely ineffective. The Japanese were fighting ghosts, burning valuable fuel in futile searches, compounding their already critical fuel deficit. By the beginning of 1945, the Japanese Empire had effectively shrunk back to its core islands. The vast empire they had seized in 1942 was now a liability. Garrisons across the Pacific, from the Solomons to the Netherlands East Indies, were strategically worthless, incapable of being supplied, reinforced, or evacuated. They were left to wither on the vine, a policy explicitly enabled by the effective destruction of the transport fleet. The subs had not only strangled the Japanese war machine, they had isolated its limbs, preventing any cohesive resistance. Specific patrols became legendary. Take, for instance, Commander Richard H. O'Kane on the USS Tang. During a single patrol near the Formosa Strait in October 1944, the Tang devastated a major convoy, sinking 5 ships in rapid succession. This patrol, however, ended in tragedy, with the Tang sinking itself with a circular running torpedo, a rare, devastating accident. Yet, the actions of O'Kane and his crew symbolized the relentless, high-stakes combat that yielded devastating results, reinforcing the American belief that commerce raiding was the ultimate strategic weapon. The total economic collapse inflicted by the submarines was the true shockwave that hit Tokyo. The nation that had prided itself on military discipline and industrial efficiency found its production lines seizing up due to simple material deficits. They could build a formidable battleship, but they could not find the coal to power the trains that delivered the armor plate. The logistical calculus of the war shifted entirely. Japan entered 1945 unable to move its armies, unable to fuel its navy, and struggling to feed its populace. The Japanese military's own estimates, often concealed from the public, confirmed the catastrophe. Internal reports revealed that by late 1944, they recognized that the lack of critical resources, especially aviation gasoline and bunker fuel, had permanently curtailed their ability to conduct large-scale offensives. They could defend, but only locally and statically. The momentum was irreversibly lost, not in a massive fleet engagement, but through thousands of small, dark encounters deep beneath the surface. Let's analyze a specific logistical horror: the impact on rubber. Southeast Asia provided the world's most vital supply of natural rubber, essential for tires, gaskets, and countless military applications. By cutting the transport lines, the U.S. subs starved Japan of this material, forcing them to rely on inferior synthetic substitutes or face total shortages. This meant lower quality equipment, vehicles breaking down more often, and aviation tires that failed under stress, all compounding the tactical disadvantages already faced by the IJN. The cumulative effect of this silent war was arguably the most significant factor enabling the Allied leapfrogging campaign. Because the Japanese garrisons could not be reliably supplied or reinforced, General MacArthur and Admiral Nimitz could bypass heavily fortified islands, knowing that the isolated troops left behind posed no enduring threat. They were neutralized by starvation and lack of ammunition long before the invasion forces arrived. The submarine fleet was the invisible shield that made the island-hopping strategy efficient and successful.
Furthermore, the submarine war resulted in a massive loss of trained manpower, not just naval personnel, but soldiers. When troop transports were sunk, the loss was often total, with thousands of highly trained soldiers drowning. Japan's ability to replace these specialized troops, especially pilots and technicians, was already strained, and the submarine attacks accelerated this depletion. The subs were not just sinking ships, they were liquidating Japan's precious, irreplaceable human capital necessary for effective resistance.
The Japanese, eventually recognizing the existential threat, attempted drastic measures. They rushed the construction of specialized escort vessels and tried to implement air cover for convoys, but these efforts were always too fragmented and too late. Moreover, by this stage of the war, American air superiority meant that even air cover was inadequate. The U.S. submarines were now operating with impunity in areas previously considered too dangerous, often surfacing in daylight to finish off crippled ships or conduct daring rescue operations.